Well, I think we're going to get started. I'm sure a few more people will join. So I'd like to welcome you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. I'm Melissa Durda. I'm a member of the philanthropy team at Synergos, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual gathering on how to ignite secular spirituality, exploring our quest for meaning. This is the second gathering of our new virtual series at Synergos, Cultivate the Soul. We are joined today by a special guest, Professor Marcelo Gleiser, who is a theoretical physicist at Dartmouth College and the 2019 winner of the Templeton Prize. His books include The Island of Knowledge, The Limits of Science, and The Search for Meaning. Okay. Over the next 60 minutes, we will go together on a journey to imagine and create a new world post-pandemic. To begin this journey, Professor Gleiser will share his views on how the COVID-19 pandemic is offering us a chance to reinvent ourselves. In the second half of this meeting, we invite you to participate in an interactive exercise that will give you a chance to share your ideas and discuss them in small groups. We will then connect together as a whole for final reflections and remarks from Professor Gleiser. We kindly ask that we use these logistics as a guide during our time together in order to do this ambitious goal together. So I'm just going to run through this, which I cannot see. Okay, sorry. So we ask you to please enable your video camera so we can be present with each other as much as possible during this time. Please name yourself clearly on Zoom. Everyone will be muted by default. Please hold your questions and comments for the discussion in the small groups. But if you have a pressing question for Professor Gleiser, please send it in a private chat message to Tarlin Say, who you'll find listed in the chat function. If you don't know how to do that, you can also in the chat function ask how to do that. You'll get instructions. If you have a problem with audio, then there's instructions here on how you can connect. You can also write it in the chat function. And this presentation is being recorded, and a video recording of Professor Gleiser's presentation will be shared by email. So without further ado, I am very pleased to hand the floor to Professor Gleiser.
Okay, well, hi everyone, wherever you are. I'm very proud and very happy to be addressing this group. So I'd like to thank Synergos for the invitation. We actually had a plan to have me present presentially in São Paulo in the end of March, but of course they had to be canceled. And I'm very glad that somehow they created this opportunity for me to discuss a few ideas with you, hopefully inspire you in some ways and learn from you as well. This is not to be a seminar in which I am going to be directly lecturing. I'm just going to talk about a few ideas that I've had concerning what is happening now and how they connect to a broader view of the world that I have been developing for a few years. And so it is within our 25-minute frame of time frame, more or less, that we're going to do this. So I'll jump right in. For those of you who had an opportunity to read the piece that I wrote for CNN a couple of weeks ago, you could see that at that point, one of the things that I wanted to stress in relation to what is happening to the world right now is that I can see from your faces, there are sort of almost, not all of us, I see Vincent is much younger, but apart from that, you know, most of us are sharing the experiences of a generation where we have been blissfully spared of having to deal with a major global confrontation. You know, when I think of my grandparents and I think about my parents, you know, I come from an European Jewish background. And so they had to deal with the First World War, the pogroms in Russia, and then they had to do with the Second World War. And our generation so far has really escaped a major kind of challenge that would somehow either pitch half of humanity against each other, or in this case, and that's what it makes it different from a world war, is really forcing us to rethink who we are in a very fundamental way, right? And we also avoided the Cold War, and at least we avoided the major confrontations that were possible with the Cold War. I'm sure you remember the Bay of Pigs incident. However, you know, at this point, the truth is that we had several, and still have several, regional confrontations, but we never really had to face anything quite like this before, right? So there are many ways in which you can think about what's going on. And if you read the news, and honestly, it's almost difficult because, to choose what to do at this point, because in one side and one point, you want to read the news, but they're so heavy and so depressing that you want to also preserve some level of humanity and sanity right now. So there is a very difficult personal choice about how much you want to immerse yourself into the maelstrom that we are finding humanity in right now, right? So we're above 2 million cases, a staggering number of deaths, you know, and about almost a third of each coming from the United States. So right now, you know, where we are, United States, at least where I am in the United States, this is very close to what we would call the epicenter of this major storm, right? And the world, as you all know, kind of came to a halt in a way that we have never seen before, right? This is unbelievable what has happened, right? The markets collapsed very quickly. They're kind of rebounding, but it's a major roller coaster. You know, for those of you who understand finance better than I do, you know, this is a true bear market in the sense that it is almost impossible to predict what's going to happen, especially with a very volatile leadership in this country and in other countries. For example, I grew up in Brazil, and the situation down there is very much the same in the sense of having a very kind of volatile and uninspired, let's put it that way, leadership at the moment coming from the presidential house. So the point is, what do we do with all this, right? And as you have seen, you know, from the two prompts that I presented to you, you know, it's really about what can we do, a part of considering this as this is the beginning of the end, a very dystopian way of thinking about humanity. Could we really use this instead as an opportunity for growth, both at the personal level and of course, much broader at a more social level, right? And now how can we accomplish that? So these are sort of the challenges, because we are now forced to be thinking in ways that we have not been forced to think before, right? I mean, because we are all pretty much in isolation. So I'm speaking to you right now from the campus of Dartmouth College in 2 hours northwest of Boston, because even though I live about 8 miles from Dartmouth, my internet at home is awful, because I actually have the luck of living in the middle of the hills and the mountains. And so the price that I pay for that is that in order to have a live Zoom session like this one, I actually have to come to campus, which happens to be completely empty right now, right? I am teaching 125 students online, which has been quite crazy because they are all over. They are from California to India and China. So how do you do this? You know, it's a logistic challenge without any precedence, right? We never had to actually deal with something like this, but we're making it work. So it so happens that this office where I am right now is an amazingly safe place because there is zero persons around, right? So don't panic when I say I am out of my house. The only reason I'm out of my house is because if I stayed in my house, not only the internet would not be good, but my 13 and 8-year-olds would probably not give me the bandwidth that I need to do this, you know, because they have their own needs. So I think that one of the obvious consequences of what's going on right now is that this crisis is exposing in a very, very open way our fragility as a species. We have to think of this moment not just as a crisis for humanity, or an economic crisis or a healthcare crisis, but it is something which is broader than that. Because, due to the successes of our industrial and economic and scientific enterprises, we sort of grew arrogant of what we can and cannot do, right? And we feel like we can conquer anything, right? That we are sort of above nature, right? That we can control nature. I mean, the whole development of science, in a sense, has been this based on this notion, which more and more we understand is the wrong notion, that we can actually use science and technology to control nature so as to position ourselves above how nature operates, right? And I think it is very clear right now that it is a very wrong way to think about our relationship with the natural world, right? That clearly we cannot place ourselves above nature, because at the end of the day, we are just a species, an animal species that shares a lot in common with all other animal species in the planet. We reproduce, we need to eat, we need to have some sort of environmental stability in order to exist and to sustain our way of life, right? And the point is that life as a whole in this planet doesn't really care about who you are, doesn't really care about what sort of political affiliations you may have or religious thinking you may have. What it cares about is reproducing. And so when the virus comes and attacks us, it's not because it has a plan to conquer humanity. It's not because nature is trying to revenge itself on us. A lot of people have asked me this. Can you think of this as a way of nature counterattacking, because of all the abuses of humanity? Nature doesn't think that way. Nature doesn't have a plan. What nature does have is a series of mechanisms that once they're forced, they're going to react, and respond to those mechanisms. And clearly, what is at the very crux of this crisis right now is the fact that we humans have become extremely efficient predators, right? And we have been feeding from all sorts of other animal forms. And many of these, they're called zoonotic viruses, right, have migrated from different animals to us, and you have examples, you have like SARS, and you have HIV, and now you have coronavirus, which is really coming from our very bad choices about how we eat as a species. So there is the issue of fragility in the sense that we cannot contain or prepare ourselves for the unknowns of nature, right? And this has a very deep connection to global warming, for example, and climate change, because one of the obvious consequences of climate change is that when you start melting the polar caps, right, what is going to happen is that in that permafrost, in that ice is not recent ice. This is ice that has been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. When our hunter-gatherer ancestors were trying to hunt and fight for survival, they were contracting diseases that have since been forgotten, and we're not immune to those diseases. So in that permafrost, we have a registration, we have a memory of all these existential battles that have been fought through thousands and thousands of years. And one of the consequences of the melting of the polar caps is that a lot of that can be released, will be released, and it is already being released into the environment. So this is not the case with this particular disease, right? But up to now, there are about 28 new different kinds of diseases that have been exposed to be stored, so to speak, in the permafrost. So there are all these unexpected connections between what's going on right now, so our biological future as a species, and how we react and control what's going on with the planet. So that teaches us many different things. One of the things is, as I mentioned before, is our fragility. And whenever you realize you're fragile, you should also become more humble about how you approach the challenges that you face in life, right? And right now, you know, it is clear to me that this virus is forcing us to really reconsider how much power we have over our individual lives and how much power we have over nature as a whole, right? And you can think of this in many different ways. And I call this sort of like the concentric spheres of being, if you want, which start with you as an individual. You as a person, you are definitely being affected by what's going on. We're all being affected by what's going on in an existential and emotional, and to some of us also economical way. This is a major slap on the face, is a wake-up call, right? So how is this impact? How is the experience of being locked up, you know, for weeks and weeks? We're now on week 5 here. Some of you in Europe have been doing this for longer than us, and in China too. How is this going to affect the way you think about who you are and how you are going to act in the world in order to prepare us better, prepare yourself, those around you, your community, so that you can respond in a more efficient way if this is going to happen again, right? You can think of different ways of acting, and they go both ways. It goes from you as an individual to your community, to society as a whole, to the planet. So these are like 4 spheres of influence. They're all codependent. We all need to work at all different levels if you want to really make a difference here, right? And the obvious relationship with the planet is that we cannot protect ourselves or escape nature. There is no such thing. We do not live in a bubble where you can just push nature aside and consider, you know, that we are above what nature has to offer to all of us, not just animals like human animals, but any kind of animal. We're all exposed to the same sort of dynamics of existence, and that is just how nature operates, right? So to me, you know, this brings home the fact that we need to reassess our codependence as well, right? There is no such thing as this human group and that human group. There is a very fundamental integration of humanity, and this is being exposed in a big way right now. You know, I keep thinking to myself when I'm reflecting about what's going on, imagine if this had hit us about 20 years ago when we didn't have the internet. For example, this wouldn't happen, right? You'd go back to like the plague of 1665 in London, right? And you can read Daniel Defoe's book about that plague, you know, where people were just quarantined in their homes. They had almost no access to information. And here we are now being able to do what we're doing. And that creates an opportunity for communal growth, right? And communion and communication are the essential roots of community, right? And what we're doing right now, I think, through this experience is to build a sense of community with the tools that we have right now for us, which in this case would be Zoom, you know, that Synergos is putting together. So we're able to actually share points of view, share different ways of thinking. And this codependence is absolutely essential because there is no, oh, the disease is going to be here or the disease is going to be only there. It's not going to affect us. Well, it's affecting everybody, right? It's affecting the whole world, and it's affecting how the whole world operates. So clearly the notion that we are codependent should lead perhaps to this idea, which I've been pushing forward, of human hive. You know, we are a human hive in a sense that we are all part of this huge mechanism and we all have a part to play. Just like if you think of our bees in a hive, they all have a fundamental part to play. And you call that collective intelligence. So there are ways in which many different groups of animals self-organize to create collective intelligence in order to survive, right? And one of the fundamental faults of humanity is that we have not done that. You know, we have always been dividing ourselves into different groups, into our tribes, right? And those tribes have been incredibly useful, you know, for tens of thousands of years. You know, when you think about our ancestors, they really did need to organize in tribes. They had to think about protecting their group. So a tribe was a very beneficial thing because, you know, if you belong to the tribe, people will provide you with food, with protection from other tribes. There'll be a code of behavior, a sort of moral code of behavior that would essentially define what are the fundamental values of that tribe. So you identify with the tribe, and that in a sense identifies who you are. And that has been pretty much the history of humanity. We split ourselves into tribes all the time, right? And there are political tribes, there are religious tribes, there are territorial tribes, and there are gender tribes. And that has been, I think, something that has defined the way humanity has operated. And I think it's time now for us to move beyond this view. It's time for us to understand, and I think this particular virus is a great way to show us why we are really a single tribe, the tribe of humans. You know, it is really our species that is in this planet, and we need to see ourselves as this species. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. I can't mute my phone because I need to be in touch with everybody. But so we need to see ourselves as the species that actually can work together, develop some level of collective intelligence to survive and keep our way of life in this planet, right? And again, different foundations are sort of bursts of this collective intelligence, you know, so it's sort of like little bursts here and there in which this is happening. But we need a new way of thinking about who we are in relation to the planet and to each other, right? And in the scientific perception, right, because as Melissa was saying, I am a scientist, first and foremost, you know, a theoretical physicist that works on these big questions about the universe, how come the universe exists, how come we're here? So it's science that becomes existential philosophy in a sense. You know, we're asking very, very big questions about who we are. And one of the fundamental lessons that we have right now is that we make a very, very big mistake as a species if we don't listen to our scientists, right? And this has been something that we have known for a while. It's something that is obvious in terms of what we have learned of global warming, right? I don't like talking about climate change. I mean, I think climate change is an euphemism. It really is global warming, and it is anthropogenic, and we know it. We have known this forever. And unfortunately, political forces are trying to muffle that or politicize this conversation, but this is an essential scientific conversation before anything else. And the same with any kind of biological warfare that we as a species may have to fight in order to preserve our existence, right? We need to listen to the scientists. And there has been kind of like a failure, which I think is a two-pronged failure, both from the scientific community to kind of not be more vocal than it has been about the need for us to be listened to. This is not the age of the end of the expertise, as some have said. This is the age in which you really need expertise, right? And then the second part of that is we need a more powerful voice as a scientific community. There have to be better mechanisms to bring what we are studying, what we are learning about the world in all different levels, from how we survive a crisis like this, what are the epidemiologists studying, what kind of vaccines we can develop, why it's important to have a vaccine. You know, can you imagine when we have a vaccine for this and the anti-vaccine people are saying, no, I'm not going to take a vaccine for coronavirus because, you know, I'm anti-vaccines. I mean, give me a break, right? This is something that absolutely is fundamental. And so we need a more powerful voice. And this is something that perhaps you as a foundation can help make happen as well, to kind of amplify the voice of certain scientists and scientific groups so that we can reach as many people, as many persons as possible across the globe, right? And that goes to different age groups and everything. Now, I know that Melissa advertised this as a sort of a talk about a search for a more spiritual age. So I just want to close with the following remarks. That would have been a completely different conversation, but given the situation we're living in right now, I had to kind of adapt it to what's going on. But let's remember the following, right? Without trying to romanticize the native cultures, but all the native cultures, I'm going to mute my phone. All the native cultures have known way before Western civilization developed that the earth was sacred, right? There was a very deep relationship between us meaning our ancestors, and the natives, and they still preserve that in many, many parts of the globe, in which earth is sacred, earth is family, you know, we're all part of the same group. So they try to anthropomorphize trees and mountains, because in doing that, we understand that they are just a big family and we are part of that family. And we sort of forgot that. And nature moved from being sacred to being a commodity. And in that transition of making nature from being sacred to being a commodity, we started to do what we have been very good at doing, which is abusing natural systems, you know, in order to extract value from it. And we forgot this connection with nature. And now that we are being exposed, and now I want to connect to the beginning of my conversation, our fragility is being exposed, our need for humility is being exposed. This is a perfect moment for us to rethink our relationship with the natural world, not in terms of what can we do to get something from Earth, but how can we celebrate our relationship with the planet so that we can live in a more constructive way, and hence, you know, not just respect all different kinds of life, but also the planet as a whole. And so this is the moment where I think it's time for us to pause and consider these aspects of our relationship to ourselves alone, ourselves in a community, ourselves in society, in the human hive, and finally ourselves in our planet, which, believe it or not, is a very, very rare planet, and one that we need to celebrate and understand how blessed we are to be here and not in some other place which is much more austere to life. So I'll stop here because I know the time is ticking, and I'll send it up to Melissa. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for those really inspiring and thought-provoking ideas that you've put forward. What we're going to do now is take some time to reflect ourselves. And, you know, what I really heard in Professor Gleiser's remarks was a call to action. What can we do on the individual level as we relate to each other, as we relate to the planet? What are some specific actions that we can commit to now, that we can think about now, as our worldview has been changed for this virus? So the exercise that we're going to do today is that we ask you, there are two parts. One is we would like you to fill in two questions, your name and name your actions. You can either cut and paste this web page here that is on the slide, or it's also going to be, the link is going to be in the chat. So what I'd like to ask you to do now is to just take a moment and to reflect What are some of the actions that you can do, that you can take in order to address some of these challenges that we're facing? And then in a few minutes, you will be moved to a virtual breakout room. For those of you who have not experienced that before, we are going to be making all of the arrangements behind the scenes. You may be asked whether you agree. And if so, please say you do agree. You'll be moved into a breakout room with for a smaller group discussion. And after 15 minutes, we will bring you back to the main room. If you have any questions, let me know or write it in the chat. Welcome all of you back. Everyone has been now moved back to the main room. So hopefully that was a process that worked smoothly for you and that you were able to have some fruitful discussions in a smaller group. In our last few minutes together, I'd like to actually allow for Professor Gleiser to give a few kind of reactions or impressions. He was sent the list of action items that those of you who filled it in sent in. And if we have some extra time, we could open it to a question or two.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a hard task because I'm sure those sentences here cannot capture what you all talked about, even if it was for such a short amount of time, 5, 6, 10 minutes, really. Clearly, we're all sort of like floored by what's going on. And one thing that became quite clear, even in my group and in other groups as well, is that as always, as the Buddha said, wherever there is light, there is shadow. And this is a moment where this is also true. And the question is, what are the choices that we're going to make, individually and collectively, so that we follow the path of light, and of course there can't just be light also, because you need a balance of tensions in the world. There is no such thing as perfection. Perfection is an idea, is not a reality, but definitely if we are looking at what is...
It is reality.
I'm sorry?
It is reality. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm very sorry.
Perfection is reality? Okay, so he's a Platonist. I won't go there right now, but we can talk about it later. But the point is that there is always this tension, and this tension lives inside ourselves too, as individuals, and how we're going to choose to move forward. I think, if anything, you are part of a very distinguished and elite group where you actually have the privilege of having ways of making a difference, and the way that can happen, it could be by promoting kindness and discipline, and perhaps creating... One of the ideas here is that we need to contribute to changing the paradigm of leadership. How do you do that? When you have leaders that use a situation like this to self-promote or promote political agendas instead, and putting that above life and the value of life of their own people that they're supposed to be serving, that is unspeakable, and that should not be accepted. So how can we tell people that this is just not the way to go? Because if you listen to people on the other side of this, there is this cult of leadership where a leader is above any mistakes, right? I mean, whatever he or she does cannot be considered a mistake because that's the leader. And people in times of need, they cling to leadership, right? And so there's a lot of opportunistic motions going on right now to kind of promote and self-promote leadership in a more autocratic way. And this, we can see this happen, for example, in Hungary, and it's happening in Brazil and here. And this is something that as a society, we can actually do something about, and the way to do that is to really kind of celebrate and live through the democratic process, as much as possible, and make sure that we actually not just do it ourselves, but create as much as we can within our own means and influence, create a worldview that speaks to this. It speaks to our need morally to actually protect each other. And so this idea of how is society going to adapt to what comes next, right? Because I heard a very good analogy the other day that once this passes, it's not going to be like turning on a light switch. It's more like a dimmer switch that is going to slowly be turning on, and the light is going to become brighter and brighter. And the speed at which this process of darkness, or what we're facing now, into light goes on, depends a lot on our actions, and the way we ourselves are going to help light that candle, right? So we each hold a candle to contribute to that collective light, so to speak. And we can do that, right? And I think I want to push forward this notion of the human hive. We need to find ways to go beyond our tribal divides. We need to find ways that identify who we are beyond our very important individual differences. And this is a moment to think about that. So when we talk about a human hive or a human tribe, that does not mean do not celebrate diversity. Quite the opposite. We must celebrate diversity within this tribe instead of pushing diversity into opposite tribes, right? And I think that's an extremely important concept, because once we are consider and understand they are in this together, that we are one, everything should be easier. And so we need to create mechanisms to be able to do that. And somebody mentioned here that it is, let me see if I find this, that Synergos as an organization can be a voice for this, can be a voice for this connectivity, for this understanding that we need to change our paradigms of leadership, the way we live in the world, the way we interact with nature, the way we eat, the way we feed our children, educate our children. All this is part of a single big notion, which I would call our collective intelligence, and how we actually could use this to grow and become smarter as a species in a planet that, honestly, the planet has been here for 4.5 billion years. We have been here for 200,000 years. So if you were to condense 4.5 billion years in 24 hours, we humans just showed up about a few fractions of a second before midnight. So we just arrived, right? And the planet will continue without us, right? It doesn't really care about us, but we care and need the planet, right? And we must understand that this is not a one-way thing, that there is really a give and take. And honestly, if we don't learn how to live in this planet creatively and symbiotically, we are going to lose the battle. It's that simple. So we need to understand that. If we don't understand that, then we're basically signing our own death sentence. Not the end of humanity as we know it, but definitely a lot of pain and suffering that could be completely avoided if we put our heads together. I think that concludes it. Thank you.
Unmuted. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. So thank you so much. This concludes the end of this session. First, I want to thank Professor Gleiser for his time and his wisdom. We were so sorry to have postponed that in-person meeting in Brazil, and thrilled that we were able to offer this online. I also want to thank all of you as participants for your time and your wisdom. Here you can see, you can find more about Professor Gleiser online at his website. It's marcelogleiser.com, where you'll learn more about his bio. I gave a very brief introduction at the beginning of this meeting, as well as his books, his essays, his blog. We will be sending out a video of the main presentation, as well as a summary of the action items that you each came up with. So thank you once again. Have a great day.